how to explain how I got into this project. It's absolutely pure magic. He was the first person to have encouraged me in my process of becoming an artist, and it was also the first person that purchased a work of mine. The first I've ever sold on a check of a bank in New York City of $1,000 when I was 23 years old. This wonderful man disappeared for a few years from my life, and when I was sort of trying to trace back where the hell did he go, I see the name of an email and I see the location of Santander. In that very same moment I'm thinking this, in the book I'm studying, the mountain of El Castillo and the main caves that I would love to even dream to visit are located a few kilometers away from Santander. So I pick up the phone and with no previous explanation of my story, I find his office number and I call him up. Hola Benjamin, ¿cómo estás? And we just trace back the last few years of not having seen each other, and I suddenly just abruptly decide to ask him directly the question, do you know anything about these caves?
Welcome to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see.
Hi there. Good morning. So today, what are we talking about? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Ceci here. Is anyone there? Hi, my name is Ceci. I'm based in Berlin, and I want to welcome you to Ceci, the podcast where you see what others see. This season is all about the mind. And today, we'll explore a world where thoughts are inscribed into enduring symbols, a hidden universe of spaces that shape memory, time, and consciousness. We will look closely at that place where the human mind becomes a landscape, and where the oldest connections between place, memory, and the human spirit can be traced. And guess with whom we'll be talking?
Our guest today is visionary Italian photographer Domingo Milella. Trained under Stephen Shaw at the School of Visual Arts in New York, his work explores the deep relationship between time, memory, and human traces on the landscape. He's known for his large-format photographs of a rare poetic eye that capture the spiritual and cultural layers embedded in ancient caves, inscriptions, tombs, and cities. His photographs image the archaeology of identity, where the boundaries between civilization and nature dissolve. Milella's work has been exhibited at prestigious institutions, including Les Rencontres d'Arles, the Venice Biennale, Foam Museum, and the Maxi Museum in Rome, and a part of public and private collections across Europe and the US, including the Margulies Collection and Borusan Contemporary. In 2023, he received the Royal Academy of Arts Brian Robertson Trust Award to support his exploration of prehistory and abstraction. The Giancarlo Ligabue Foundation in Venice dedicated an exhibition called Futuro Remoto to his research, and in 2025 he collaborated with the Fondazione Pino Pascali and the Puglia region to bring Il Teatro del Tempo to life, a special exhibition and show on the Deer Cave, a crucial Neolithic site in the Mediterranean. The images produced by Milella's camera are pure magic. They listen and patiently reconstruct spaces that remind us of those inner caves where history, myth, and memory overlap, helping us to understand the interconnection of the human spirit with nature and the cosmos.
The amazing Domingo Milella. Welcome.
Thank you, grazie. It's a true pleasure to be here in a sort of time and space changing room. It feels very protected, a bit like a cave, perhaps.
Domingo, I first encountered your work over 10 years ago. And what it struck me then, I have to say, and still resonates, was your fascination with the outskirts of cities, ancient ruins, and cemeteries. And I remember specific images now, the coast of Puglia, the ruins of Petra. And what captivated me in these photographs, whether I was seeing them in person or recalling them in my mind, was your ability to reveal the underlying tension between nature and human-made structures. The way architecture and landscape seemed to merge into transitional terrains. These were, I have to say, landscapes of incredible clarity, vast spaces that invited expansive, deep breathing, almost asking one to slow down and inhabit them. Tell us a little bit about yourself, about who was Domingo in this phase, and his relationship with the camera and the environments that he so brilliantly captured.
This is an interesting description. The fact you mentioned the town on the sea. You make me see the water in a certain way in your description, and the ruins next to the water. And I think that's in a certain way the landscape of my belonging, the south of Italy and the Mediterranean in general. I think I was extremely attracted to a search for my own self in the landscape. So it's never been about going to a place or wanting to document or photograph. I think the fact that I use photography is just a coincidence. It could have been writing, it could have been poetry, it could have been sculpture, it could have been drawing or painting. But I think since I was 16, 17 years old, I felt the need to look for myself. And photography came as an accident. I mean, my father gave me a little camera when I was 17, and I started to experiment in the suburb of my city, Bari. And that experiment, I think, was looking for my identity. So, right, the first word that comes to mind is identity.
And during this artistic phase, as I mentioned, you created visual environments that allowed the observer to coexist with magnified images without feeling overwhelmed. And that's a fascinating thing about your photographs. And they're carefully balanced. They offer clarity and calm. But that phase eventually came to an end around the time of digitalization began to make its entrance in the field. And during this time, you too entered a deep personal phase of transformation.
In the summer of 2014, I went through a very deep emotional and creative crisis. I decided to sequester myself in a small flat alone on the shores of a forgotten village on the Ionian Sea, the very same place where I spent my childhood vacations. I felt like a part of me was dying. And as a stranded whale, I decided to wash on the shores of memory and innocence. I could barely sleep more than 2 hours a night. I was obliged to ask for help, and that very same summer, I began through therapy a new voyage into the profound, the hidden, and the past.
You started photographing ancient caves. The images became a sort of timeless dream, a profound search for meaning. The landscape became infinite. And you were talking now about identity. As if one could travel into the territory of mankind's consciousness. This is a moment of tremendous internal confrontation, a moment, as we heard in your own words, when you went through a period of deep despair. And I thank you for allowing me to use these precious writings of yours, which describe this painful experience and that will be accompanying us throughout this interview. And then, Domingo, in the midst of all these catharsis, there you were in southern Spain, standing at the foot of El Castillo mountain, standing before those drawings, that came from the minds of our ancestors, who, just like us, imagined and carved and painted, expressing what they saw in their inner worlds. Tell us about your journey from overcoming this crisis to entering for the first time, the very first time, into the cave La Pasiega, which you call the washing machine of time.
Well, there is such a vastity in these very few seconds we crossed. Actually, there is a lifetime in a certain way. So I connected while we were doing this time travel, I connected to something that actually happened to me when I was 18 years old. And it has to do with my beginning in photography, because the entrance in the cave is a first beginning, but is also a sort of second beginning. But there is both origins in trying to restart and trying to start. So I go back to when I'm 18 years old, and I move from Bari to New York City. And I think this is actually a crucial factor for the whole story. For my personal story, we will try to look at today. And I was very uncertain about what to do in life. I wanted to probably study movies, but I couldn't get access to through a test at NYU. And I wanted to pursue my intuition of photography. But to buy this very large camera obscura I wanted to use, I wanted to learn how to use, I asked my father in Italy to sell a clock. I received this clock for my first communion by my uncle. It was a beautiful Rolex from the 60s with a dark green background. And it's very interesting that to begin my journey in photography, I asked my father to sell a clock. So to sell away time, or to sell away an object that contains, in a very wealthy and prestigious shape, time. But somehow I think in that moment I was signing a contract with something invisible. And my being from the south of Italy, my being from a very ancient place in New York, was the origin of my interest for the profound, for the lost, for the primitive, in a way. But I didn't know when I was 18. It took more than 10 years. It took a whole sort of formation of identity to arrive to understand the barriers of life, because I formed myself in a sort of very brave and courageous way. And this large camera, that was the transformation of the clock, became my tool to face the early stages of life, my 20s. So to form myself against any odd, against any obstacle in a certain way, the large camera that was the transformed form of time was my way to grow and become a human in a way. And I think living in New York, being there under the collapsing World Trade Center, forming myself in a culture that wasn't mine, and trying to shape my muscles as a human being, led me to a very critical condition, meaning I had to transform myself so deeply. In a way, it was not sustainable. And I was also a very successful young artist. I did my first show in London when I was 26, then my show in New York when I was 28. I started to work for the New Yorker, for the New York Times. I started to do very important commissions. And as an artist in my early 30s, this was in a certain way probably over real and overhandable. And I really didn't know, as you would say in Italian, where to lay the egg. I was very prolific, very active, traveling across the world, but I wasn't finding the key. And this led me to move myself across different cities and arrive at 33 years old that for a series of reasons I was unable to continue what I was doing. And at the time I was living in London, and it was simply not working. And I had this sensation that the images I was looking for were not anymore my images. And I needed to come out of this. But how do you come out of something like this? Maybe you can spend the rest of your life being in something like that. And I think my soul was much more clear and strong than the reality of life, and also the reality of my success, of my beautiful studio in the east of London, of 3 galleries I was working with across the world. And the first moment in my life when I was somehow truly independent. But that was exactly the point where I collapsed. The point when everything seemed to be fitting.
Yeah. Logically fitting.
And it wasn't, anything was logically fitting. They were all constructions. And that's when the coincidences of life lead me to the cave and to a deep, deep transformation.
And in this process of becoming aware that you're describing, this life process of becoming aware of life, of existence, this deep soul searching, and then the cathartic process you have to went through, which shook you to the core. Was this the kind of initiation that young boys go through in ancient cultures? Because that's the way, like, I pictured it, that you had to go through all this process and then this cathartic depression of so much pain that would prepare you to stand before that cave, before you went into this cave. Did you see it as a kind of initiation before going into the cave?
Well, the idea of dying, the idea of failing, the idea of the limit. The thing is that we live lives and we have constructions that are very much based on the desire of what's around us, be it the family, be it the society, be it the expectations of what's around us. But the truth is that events like very strong depression or an emotional breakdown, they don't come as illnesses, they come as a form of truth. So for me, when I turned 33 years old and the world I built until I was 33 years old collapsed, that was the moment I was naturally led to the cave. It wasn't even a narrative. There was no construction. It was a necessity. And the coincidences around it were very clear because this idea of the inside was lingering. But I was not ready for it. So at 33 years old, I basically went against a wall. And this wall, we could call it real reality instead of my own reality, even though I was very lucky and privileged to build a wonderful first reality. But at 33, something happened that was, look, it's very hard to describe this in words. It's not something you can just put into a single narrative. There is so many layers about it. But basically, I think the first part of Domingo finished, and this was linked to demonstrate something, and it's a victory. It's a victory to be able to arrive to a point in which you don't need to demonstrate, but you need to find the core of something instead of being in the outside. This early part of search for me was always far away and outside. So this camera that pointed its lens at ruins across the Mediterranean, in Mexico and around the world in a way, was looking for something outside.
Yeah.
When I turned 33 years old, that summer, the summer of which we are talking about, of 2014, basically something finished. It's like as if a sand clock finishes all its grains in one side and there is nothing more. So that sand clock, which was the first part of myself, had to be turned upside down to restart the clock. And that clock was so precise that led me to this void. And the void is, of course, is obscure, is unknown, is impossible to grasp, and is very scary. And I was very scared at 33 years old. So my arriving at the at Mount Castillo, as the narrative describes, is in a certain way an invisible road that led me in front of the most instinctual, the most true, and the most visceral imagination I could find.
It's like following a celestial trace. And the most fascinating also thing about it is that you were about to entering for the first time into the cave, sharing all of this space with men and women of the Ice Age who lived and thrived right there. The lines, the geometric forms, the animals, the hands, Did it feel like entering a shared common mind?
Magic is a very difficult thing to explain. Very difficult. I think this description I gave of this young man that looks at the outside world only to find demonstration of his own identity and his own personality, which is the first part of my life, then starts to listen to something else. And this listening come in interesting shapes. The space I entered going into the cave has to do much more with the invisible and the interior. And definitely it's a space where time doesn't exist, because there is no difference between 28, 30, 35 or 40,000 years ago, because the darkness and the way humanity tried to bring his own soul into this interior, it's still present. So without going now exactly into the archaeological matters of Ice Age and Paleolithic art, what I'm interested in and what I want to try to share is this lack of filter and lack of constructions. I went into caves because I was looking for a connection with the primordial and the essential. So in a certain way, the interior of the mountain is the interior of a treasure, and this interior of a memory that doesn't only belong to humans. This memory is the point of encounter of a memory that belongs to the world and a memory that belongs to humans, and they are together there. So something which is crucial to all of this discourse is the digital age. My need for prehistoric imagination and my search into the caves was highly determined by the pressure of the digital era and the way images were offered and are offered to us today. So it might sound a bit crazy or paradoxical, but I needed to make photographs of spaces that were out of the world, because I needed to find again images that were in the world. Because somehow I was extremely worried and extremely anxious of how the digital language was becoming pushy, sort of warning, and the digital world was sort of haunting.
Mm-hmm.
With its idea of speed, its idea of precision, its idea of efficiency.
Of volume.
Of volume, quantity. Everything about it was not fitting with me. It never did in a certain way, because I chose, when my father sold that clock when I was 18 years old, I chose the most analog and traditional medium you could choose. So this idea of the camera obscura, of the darkroom you carry with you, this large camera with a bellow, the lens in the front, the film, because I still photograph with film, is somehow, for however banal it might sound, but is actually one of the key ingredients of this recipe. The cave is the place where I find again a sort of analog legacy. And the camera obscura, which is the instrument I use, and the cave itself are both very similar, as much as also the human eye is a cavern. So the camera, the cavern, my eye were encountering. And the great fatigue was to find as an artist these colliding languages.
And talking about this inner world and the bodily connection to it, in one of your descriptions of going through the cave passages, you talk about how the painted animal forms, which are often found on cave ceilings, have little or no muscular resistance, as if there were no gravity at all. They seem to float like magical figures, like ghosts, spirits, or perhaps even souls. When I read these, I was reminded of the description of gravity given by one of our guests in the Serious Movement, NASA astronaut Jose Hernandez, when he recounts the launch of the Discovery space shuttle, in how his body felt as they crossed the atmosphere into space at supersonic velocity, and his experience of weightlessness. He traveled beyond the Earth's atmosphere and found himself in the darkness of the cosmos. Let's listen.
You're sitting there, and the three engines light up, so you hear this gentle roar, and you feel it, a gentle vibration. You close your visor, and you turn on your oxygen so that you're in a closed environment. And then a second later, the two solid rocket boosters turn on. The noise level goes up order of magnitude. The vibration it feels like it's a 9.5 earthquake. And just when you think it's going to fall over, you feel a push in your back, and that's liftoff. And you go from 0 to 17,500 miles an hour in 8.5 minutes. You pull 3 Gs in the process. In other words, it feels as if 3 people are standing on your chest, so it's even hard to breathe as you're going up. But once you're up there, you reach main engine cutoff, MECO, and at 17,500 miles an hour, and all of a sudden that big 500-pound gorilla disappears, and now you're loosey-goosey in your seat with your seatbelt, and now you're going around the world once every 90 minutes at 17,500 miles an hour.
Jose Hernandez, the son of undocumented Mexican immigrants who harvest crops throughout the year, embodies an incredible story of endurance, character, discipline, and resilience. And despite facing many challenges, he achieved his dream of becoming an astronaut. As you said, he dreamed. And finally reached the stars. I think came to different realizations, not only going into the space shuttle and reaching the stars physically, but innerly. When you enter the cave, Domingo, for the first time, or in general, being inside any of the caves you visited and photographed, did you sense any kind of bodily reaction similar to what Jose described when crossing into space?
I think they have a lot of similarities, the description of transition from one world to another. The cave is a protected space, and it's very special. It makes me think of the blankets, of the interior of a bed. It makes me think of a very close embrace in darkness. It's not a place of fear, not only. It's a place where fear gets overcome, and there is a form of safety and a form of security. But it's a very strange form of safety. It's a form of belonging. And it's a form of being in a place that embraces you. But this embrace is a sort of superior thing. And I think this idea of superiority and safety was something that prehistoric man must have searched for. And I think I was looking for the same myself. I was looking for a place where I could be somehow just my body and my mind and my heart, and listen. A bit like a sort of shelter from the storm. And maybe what we said before about the digital age or the world we live, I think maybe the cave was also for me a bomb shelter. And the explosion outside was the explosion of the digital world, as we said before. And this tenderness and the way the cave becomes a scary place at the beginning, and then a place where you find your own corner, your own comfort, your own heartbeat, your own breath, and also your own vision. Because the cave is also a place where there is no disturbances of any kind, and vision can be enhanced. And so it brings clarity to the images that are inside. And I am quite sure, even though this is very hard to demonstrate scientifically, that the world of dreams and the world of sleep and the world of imagination, for me and for prehistoric men as human beings, must have been a presence in the depth of the mountain and inside the cave, because there is intimacy in these places. It's not just a sort of strange and absurd event that humanity went to look for his own earliest form of symbolic thinking and something we could call religion, something we could call art, because in reality we don't have the words to describe these things. And this search is extremely physiologic and extremely human. And so I think the reasons why I went with my camera obscura underground, and the reason why humanity so many centuries ago went down to look for these sensations is almost the same.
Domingo, venturing into the realm of the prehistoric caves, I think was like stepping into another dimension, as you have been narrating, and entering into the deepest realms of the universe. In this encounter between intimacy that you were mentioning and consciousness, did you feel connected to something spiritual when you first entered the deer cave? Or did you feel as though something eternal was there, present?
This is very hard to put in words. I mean, a lot of the things we are trying to talk about are very difficult to put in words. But I want to connect again to this idea of space and of the rocket and of the journey and of the unknown and of the sky, because I think this is quite crucial to understand the space of the cavern, the space of the idea of making art and making symbols into the deep labyrinths and hidden part of a cavern. Because most of us don't know that some of the most fascinating and crucial images of prehistoric art are sometimes half an hour, 1 hour, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes 4 hours deep from the sunlight. So this idea of the depth and the cosmos must have been present in our ancestors. They had no history of science. They had no geology books. They had no categories. There is no history of explanations. So we need to go into a sort of invisible history, which is very hard to talk about because it's ungraspable and is surely more similar to the world of dreams. But this idea of not knowing, this idea of ignorance, for me, it's crucial to this idea of the cosmos. We live in an age in which we really think we have sort of squared the explanations.
That we frame everything.
Yeah, we have an hashtag for everything, no? And we designed a world in which everything is searchable instantly, viewable instantly. You can purchase a book of explanations instantly. This instantly known is exactly and reciprocally the most reverse thing to what I was trying to search for in the caves and what I think also my ancestors were searching in the cave. And is not different than the journey of an astronaut. The rocket, the sound of the rocket, this idea of going past yourself and connect to something else and something larger.
And the silence, right?
A very cozy, beautiful silence. I come back to want to use these words as describing a sort of reverse birth. The cave and Ice Age art tell us a lot of also this idea of return. A return to what? A return to who? I am not the person to say. But I can definitely use the word journey and the word return. And the darkness was a measure of a new way of knowing. We have explanations for the geological space, they had not. So this idea to go past what is definable, it's essential to this work I've been doing, and it's essential also to the way to approach the symbols and the images of our ancestors.
The symbols and drawings and the bat droppings, everything to me, as all of this inside the caves, everything to me seemed that it could be like the ultimate expression of a collective memory, condensed just there in that safe space. Whether for Ice Age men and women 40,000 or more years ago, or us, just in the eyes of the observers. Who cares how many years had passed?
It doesn't matter, in fact.
It doesn't matter. So this immersion in the cave changed your sense of time and of memory and of human existence. After becoming aware of all of this, how do you think about today about those concepts, time, memory, and existence?
You see, I can only do the little job of myself and the artist and the human I am, and I can connect and share and tell the story. And this is already has a magic value to shelter, connect, and tell the story. It's not a search for a document, and it's not a search for proof. It's not a search for a fact. I think what I'm trying to do and what I love about this making of images is this relationship with the unknown and to create forms of positive ignorance. Because somehow I wasn't attracted by the archaeological data or the things you need to demonstrate about this topic. It's more about opening to a form of ignorance, and is also a reaction to the ignorance and the way digital language work, and what we said, this sort of language of the instance. And the language of the instance for me became a need for a counterbalance of a language of eternities. And what you say about collective memory, it's very true. These are images that don't have explanations because they are already explained in our species and they are explained in the world. The presence of the animals, the presence of the geometric symbols, the discs, the negative hands, all this language that we can encounter in the underground is the survival of human memory, cannot be erased. Is not only preserved by the darkness of the cave, but is also preserved by the fact that it is the umbilical cord of our species with the world.
Domingo, now that I'm thinking, I'm very visual in my mind, so I'm thinking about outer space and caves. And there's an overlapping. And in this overlapping, there's of these two environments is darkness, as you've been now talking about. And we're going to go deep into darkness. But first, I have to ask you, and I want to ask you to give us a little bit of context and tell us or describe for us, please, how does the darkness outside the caves is compared to the darkness inside them?
Well, this is a very interesting overlap. I think that there is no exact darkness as the darkness in the caves. Because also I imagine prehistoric humanity living in a world often cold, sometimes a bit colder than our, we are actually warming, and they lived in different phases also of a cooling world and of cold steppes. And I imagine that a world without humanity, or with very few humans, was a very bright world. Was a world in which also the night was very bright. And you have to imagine vastities that are immense, and moonlight and starlight is extremely present. And the day is, of course, even brighter. So this a very ancient human, which is exactly like me and you here, and with the same heritage as body and mind, there is basically no difference, is going to search for this other darkness, for this sincere darkness, for this total darkness. And is going there to ask questions, and is going there to relate with this darkness. When I talk about this, often it becomes a very delicate topic, but I am convinced of this relationship with darkness.
We will hear an excerpt from Barbara Holmes' book, Race and the Cosmos, in which she discusses the beauty of darkness. She elaborates on the idea that the cosmos is a metaphor for the self and our origins, drawing parallels with the womb that nurtures the human race. She's a scholar specialized in African American spirituality, mysticism, cosmology, and culture. Let's listen.
In the beginning, there is darkness. It is the womb out of which we are born. Darkness may be the blessed dimming of ego-driven striving, a destination and condition of safety and repose. In this state of trusting refuge, the light of divine revelation, which pierces but does not castigate the darkness, may finally be seen. This is a mothering darkness that nurses its offspring.
Darkness is as complex and unique as any other event of the cosmos. In my book, Race in the Cosmos, I say, yes, there is a darkness that opposes light and rejects the power of divine transformation and tries to extinguish hope and promise. But there's also a darkness that is a dwelling place of God and a comfort to the comforter, a place where the God consciousness can pause. And I call it a natal darkness because it's the womb out of which all of creation is born. It's a genesis space for let there be and nurture. So I'm describing a darkness that's like a very rich loam, a dirt that strengthens us, encourages us to push deep roots into the dark earth, where we can grow toward the light fed by the darkness. There are many darknesses yet to be revealed, and in the book, I talk about dark matter and dark energy and our dark universe. For physicists and cosmologists are only recently finding out that the majority of what is in the cosmos we can't see. And they call it, because they don't know what it is, dark matter and dark energy.
So we've talked before about the camera oscura resembling the interior of the caves you visited. But now after hearing what Barbara Holmes said, how do you interpret her words after experiencing also this kind of darkness? It's probably like the reversed birth you were talking about, right?
Dying and being born are two of the largest mysteries of our species. We don't know where we come from, and we don't know where we're going. And the space of obscurity of the cave has to do with this mysterious motherhood. How could it not have a relationship with these questions? The world of the dead and the world of the still one to come. Also, if you think of the word antenati in Latin languages, and you divide it in two, ante natum, before to be born, but is also the dead ones. So there must have been a circular consciousness of something else that was before and after. And the description I just heard makes me think of some early representations of the human body, some of the most ancient representation of the human body, which are called Venuses of the Ice Age. Of course, Venus is a bit of a Greek projection on this deep, deep, deep past. And I think these extremely fertile, large breasts, large hips, figures, which are extremely present next to the images of animals, next to the images of geometric patterns of our deep, deep past, have a special feature. The majority of these objects of mobiliar art, or these symbols, sometimes portable, sometimes larger, don't have eyes, nose, and mouth. They bear a faceless representation of the mother of mothers, of the great mother, some people say. So somehow this dark motherhood, which doesn't have a specific feature, is the force of life, the force of death, and also the force of nature. And there is a collision with this obscure matter we're talking about, a sort of unknown force and an invisible force. But I'm always very carefully in venturing in these considerations with rational words and with description, also because I want to recollect my job as an artist is the one to connect strings and elements, not to explain.
Your way of explaining or connecting your senses into the images you were discovering is your camera. So talking about your camera and coming back to the summer of 2014, you preciously wrote,
That summer, I brought with me only two symbolic things, my large format camera, and an anniversary edition of the 1851 Moby Dick. The book, as if a talisman, stayed unopened on my night table during those stormy days. Same fate with my camera. I locked in a closet as if in punishment. At that moment, it was unimaginable to make a photograph whatsoever, ever again.
Clearly, when you put your camera away, you also shut yourself off from the world. And having emerged with a new sense of awareness that we talked before about, how did the relationship with your new eyes and your camera changed? What was it rediscovered? Or better to say, was this a rediscovery of your own senses, of your eyes looking through the camera oscura, or was it more like a rencounter?
But this is a very wealthy and open matter. I chose this very, very large camera, this 20 by 25 centimeter negative darkroom, portable darkroom you use to make these very sensual, rich, detailed images. I chose it in the first place to make very vast landscapes. After this deep crisis and this journey we described as the going of outside, the moment I came up with the idea of bringing this large camera in the cave, I was doing something absolutely wrong. There is no reason why to go into a narrow space in a mountain, in tunnels, with a large format camera. It makes no sense. But I think actually that rebel, that unmeaningful gesture was the most revolutionary thing I could do to myself, because I brought all the heaviness and complexity of my language to a place that was much more complex than me. And I had to kneel down and be humble and work in narrow areas with the darkness and light, and work in a way that was almost like cooking blindfolded in a place where you don't even know the ingredients. So this gesture of bringing the large format camera in the cave, that was the Dadaist and the child birth that was reactivating a new artist. So I wasn't changing myself or my instruments. I was really changing all the rest around. So Domingo was still somehow the same, but was offered to a completely upside down setting of rules and coordinates, as if the geography was again flipped down.
How courageous to have accepted that offer. But I suppose there was no...
In that moment, it's a very beautiful story. Mm-hmm. It's made of humanity and coincidences. The first cipher that came during that year of crisis, that year of death, because somehow a part of me died to make...
Had to die.
Yeah, to make the sand clock reverse and to make it upside down. I was also physically obliged to be put upside down.
But was this... and now what I meant, could you make a choice? Or, because I didn't finish my phrase, and I wanted, because sometimes I'm very slow thinking, or you didn't have a choice. It was already done, and it was a process.
I didn't have a choice. It was written.
It was written.
It was written in many inexplicable ways. And there is some interesting appearances or magic that happen around these things. The year I was reflecting on what to do, a very dear friend of my aunt died, and coming out of the funeral in Milan, across the Palace of Justice, the Palazzo di Giustizia, there is a little chariot that sells books for €3, €4, €5. And in that chariot, on the top part of the trailer, there was a glass window with one book that was really on the top, that nobody wanted, nobody touched for years. It was the only one that costed €80 compared to the one at €3. And I read the title, and it was called The Origins of Art. And there was a little sentence underneath it that said, l'eterno presente, the eternal present. That word, exactly that word was the key to the beginning of this change for me.
It's like these little symbols that, being aware of these little symbols written in the celestial trace.
As if the horoscope is writing you. It's very arrogant to think that we are writing our own horoscope. is looking and connecting. That book was a crucial encounter because it's the first time I discovered through the reading of that book in the most complex time of my life that it existed abstract art and it existed from many thousand years ago. And there was in the north of Spain, in the deep of some caves, abstract paintings.
And before we go to abstraction, because that I want to really dive into with you, and coming back to books, Moby Dick, the book that you brought with you. Well, I thought about it because the whale there symbolizes the unknown, the unknowable. And Ahab's obsession with hunting has to do with man's struggle to conquer nature and fate, which is a little bit the opposite of what we're seeing here because it's an existential subject. It doesn't resolve. You having gone through this catharsis and discovering your inner child, not to mention finally finding the energy afterwards to open Moby Dick for the first time, what did you make of the whale's song? What would you have liked to tell Ahab about his obsession?
Our whole civilization is Ahab. The problem is, where is the whale? And what does the whale feel and what does the whale think? Because Ahab is already certified. The world we live in is the result of a gigantic drawing and plan. The master plan is Ahab plan. My question about the whale and my relationship with whales, it's very strong and it's very instinctual. I can't explain it, but I feel related to these underwater creatures. These mammals have something that makes me feel brotherhood or sisterhood. And this similarity, whenever I've encountered them at sea, is a very special emotion because it's understanding that you are not alone. Beside all the human creations and the artificiality of society and of culture, there is something about understanding the relationship of species and the connection with the larger ecosystem that is extremely important. And the song, it's the demonstration that we give art as one of the primordial representation of the human species as we want it to see, as we want to see ourselves. But the fact that some species of whale can communicate each other in undecipherable codes across hundreds of miles of bodies of waters, it's a demonstration of our size and also the size of our art and of our ambition.
Fantastic. I believe imagination to be one of the superpowers with which we human beings are bestowed with. But what is imagination? And why is it so important? We will hear what acclaimed poet and President Emerita of PEN International, Jennifer Clement, has to say about imagination, with an excerpt of the manifesto she wrote about freedom of imagination, followed by Richard Martin, Stanford University's leading professor of classics, clear and insightful thoughts on culture, imagination, and artificial intelligence.
The thing about the imagination that's so important, it's where all discovery happens. So, you're not going to go to the moon unless you imagine that you can go to the moon. I mean, without imagination, there's no discovery. It's a very important part of what it means to be human.
PEN believes the imagination allows writers and readers to transcend their own place in the world, to include the ideas of others. This place for some writers has been prison, where the imagination has meant interior freedom and often survival. The imagination is the territory of all discovery, as ideas come into being as one creates them. It is often the confluence of contradiction, found in metaphor and simile, where the most profound human experiences reside. For almost 100 years, PEN has stood for freedom of expression. PEN also stands for and believes in the freedom of the empathetic imagination, while recognizing that many have not been the ones to tell their own stories.
I think the first fear that people have is that somehow technology driven by AI will just take over and on its own do things like start wars or break down the infrastructure of water and electricity. I worry about that, but I worry even more as a teacher of humanities that AI will take away imagination. It will take away precisely the kind of muses, the space for transcendence that Greek theater and Greek culture cherished so much. Because once you can just say to AI, write me a novel, write me a poem, and it coughs out something that's convincing, but there's no human heart there, it's a new Pandora. And the question for me would be whether, we invest in certain myths that are then going to kill off a culture. The myth of the salvation of humanity because of artificial intelligence is a really dangerous one. So let's hope that the culture doesn't die and take its myths with it.
What are your thoughts on these?
Wow, beautiful. Beautiful. Imagination as technology and not technology as imagination. I think we are living exactly the reverse of this balance. We've given so much trust to technology to create imagination, to use technology to feed its own power, that we're not realizing that the technology is us and that imagination is the crucial, most important appointment we cannot miss. And I think this body of work I've been trying to do, or my fatigue to bring the history of photography inside the history of images, was a way to make the two opposite things encounter, to make images that were rooted in the body and in the memory of the world, and not make constructed artificial simulations.
Talking about imagination, a fellow guest for this season, Mind, 4-time Grammy-winning drummer, composer, producer, and educator, Terry Lynn Carrington, has the following question for you.
I'm Terry Lynn Carrington, and my question is for Domingo Milella. Do you get the feeling that the drawings were made with a consciousness of being abstract, or if they were trying to depict their reality? Meaning, do you think they were trying to be artistic or purely realistic and practical?
Perhaps they were trying to be both, or they were both, because many of these categories we've built across history, and we have a culture now and a language of division and compartment. We cannot say, and we don't know what it truly was, the space and the mind space and the imagination and the value of this imagination they had. So this is actually a beautiful mystery. But in this mystery, we can definitely say that the world of dreams, the world of reality, the hunting of animals, the request to the spirit of animals, the incomprehensible abstract structures painted in the caves, all collide in a dialogue in which imagination must have been a fluid entity between real and the real.
Where everything overlaps.
Exactly. And the territory of magic. Magic is in the imagination, in the power of imagination. So even this mythology and narratives of the shamans, which we find a lot in the explanation of prehistoric art or in the explanation of the deep, it's a way of isolate and once again apply compartments to the human ability, to human history. Definitely there were some individuals more able or engaged in practices that were special, but I think humanity itself shares something. And I think in this aspect we need to look at, or at least I look at a lot, and I find some interesting explanations in the idea of collective unconscious and in the work of Jung. And also I did some beautiful encounters reading James Hillman and finding this resonance with the fact that imagination and dream is our most important tool of development, survival, and ability to navigate the real and the unreal, because they both relate with each other. So, coming back to this idea of artistic or not artistic, real and unreal, I think my answer to the question, it's magic. They were doing it for magic reasons.
When you were inside these caves and confronted by all of these expressions of existence created between 40,000 years old or 18,000, whatever, or some other case.
There is big jumps.
Yeah. These symbols, carvings, and drawings made in a very deep geological spaces, which are sometimes only revealed after walking for hours through difficult terrain in the dark, in humidity, overcoming many physical challenges to finally be able to reach them or to become available. It is in stark contrast to the immediacy of the images we are confronted in the digital age on a daily basis, and which we have been tapping upon this idea during this interview. As a photographer who uses images to express and communicate what you see, what you find, and who takes the time to search for the moment, the angle, the light, I can just imagine how overwhelming digitalization must have been, an endless shower of images. And memory has always been subjective and selective in our minds. What is your opinion on the effect that digitalization has had or will have on how we remember images, particularly in the context of photography?
This is a very challenging reflection. But your words make me think first of a memory. So I begin from my memory to then arrive to your question. I was probably 8 or 9 years old in a day of high fever. I think the fever that morning reached 39, 40, so it was pretty transformative fever. And my mother had to go outside of the house, and I wasn't, of course, going to school, and I remained alone for a couple of hours. And I made a game when I was alone that I would sometimes do even when I was fine, not with such a high fever. But this time with the fever, the game became more special. I went with a small flashlight under the blankets of the big bed of my parents, and I would go slowly searching for the corner of the bed where the blankets go under the bottom, and going with this small flashlight, imagining that in that space there was something else. But during this experience of the high fever, I felt that this curve of fabric was actually leading to another space. And I was absolutely sure during this experience that that other space existed. So somehow this connection and this memory makes me think that the child and the fantasy and the ability to be playing with reality and with imagination are things that work like a garden. And the garden needs to be cured, planted, watered, protected. And now we are living in a time of a storm. And this garden of imagination is under high threat. And the idea of memory is also crucial to this. And actually, this leads to a lot of things I've discovered in the past couple of years that makes my self shiver at the thought that imagination and memory are deeply connected. And it seems that actually also in our brain, the way the hippocampus works during deep sleep, and it relates with part of the brain very active in the ability to imagine the future, are highly flirting with parts of the brain that are the one able to process memory and to store memory.
Exactly. If you allow me, I like to share with our audience your reflections on how digitalization felt for you. You call it a tsunami.
My personal crisis and the crisis of the language I'd chosen were colliding in one. The contemporary tsunami of digitalization has been uprooting the nature of a possible unique experience of memory, time, and meaning. I lost the present as an artist and as a person, and I had lost trust in a possible meaningful image of time. This deep delusion, isolation, and pain allowed me to stop. Now I could walk away from the blinding lights of innovation, speed, and production. I could sit back on the ground of disillusion.
And you mentioning at the beginning of an interview how your sensorial capacities sharpened inside the cave, and then also this path to go through to be able to reach the different parts of the cave. It's this experience that is connected directly to our bodily experience, of the sensorial experience. And so I just think how this digital speed affects our minds, because you don't have the time to have the experience, the bodily experiences. Probably we capture them in our mind, but they're really just like very strong shots, like just information that travels, I don't know in what kind of velocity. So do you think that speed and the vast volume of images we receive may end up destroying our memory?
It should be important in front of a question as big as this, Cecilia, to also probably ask ourselves what memory is. Because perhaps we have also a misconception of memory. We think of it as data, as information, when probably memory is an ability to be in the body and to be in the history of your body and to be in the environment with your own true presence. So memory is a form of recollection, so to bring things to the heart. Also because in the Latin word recollection or remember, both words lead to this idea of to recollect, so retake and rebring or recur, repetition, and cur or cuore, to bring again to the center.
You make me think about the bodily memory that prima ballerina Elisa Carrillo talks about when hearing the music and how the body reacts directly to the music.
What I find amazing, it's sometimes you dance something and a couple of years you don't perform it. And the day you have to do it again, sometimes you don't, if you try to think of the movement, it doesn't come to your mind. But as soon as the music plays, your body remembers.
Also, a therapy that Professor Schwartz applies, in which he talks about the different parts of the body being like a family and how they should be revisited and reunited after having been disassembled by trauma.
But this seems to me that we live in an age in which this trauma is collective. The body has been separated from the psyche. But why should it ever be different? The mind and the body. Why are they separated? Or why we don't say that I have a sensation that regards everything, regards both the body and the psyche? And maybe memory. Memory has to do with this because we look at it only as a cerebral thing. We don't look at it as an holistic phenomenon. Maybe the passage of growth or the passage of change has also to do with the fact that the psyche and the body are the same thing. And memory is what can glue the two pieces.
Hi, we would love to hear your comments and learn about what you see. Share your input at www.ccpodcast.com and follow us on social media. Oh, I almost forgot. To accompany us in this season's journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And now let's continue with Ceci.
Domingo, El Castillo, Pêche, Mallet, Saint-Tien, Chauffin, Mio, Grotta del Romito, and La Pasiega, to name a few. Each has their own unique character and magic. Last year, the Camilla Grimaldi Gallery in Rome hosted a fantastic exhibition of yours called Astrazione, which translates as abstractions or abstraction. The exhibit features a series of photographs in which you juxtapose your investigations into prehistoric art in ancient caves with contemporary human expressions like graffiti and wall drawings. And in this way of juxtaposing both of these notions, one can see how over time these traces gradually eroded and were transformed into contemporary memories. When you look at those prehistoric images, they feel so intimate, so close and powerful. So could you tell us, how did the ancient cave art you've explored fit into your work, inspiring you to go all the way into abstraction?
This is a process that is still happening. So it's not resolved. It's in the river of the present. Well, in fact, I think that we probably portrayed a partial side of the story. We sort of traveled across time and space, and we designed an image also of what I do that it's extremely romantic and is extremely poetic. But also there is the reality of 2021, 22, 23, 24, and the year we are in now, the present. There is also the present in the equation, and we live in the present. So the truth is that there is a sister, a sort of twin sister to the prehistoric brother. While I was working in the caves in the north of Spain, in France, in Italy, and I was developing my own knowledge of the primordial, I was also walking around and living a normal life and having an iPhone in my pocket and listening to music. While I was doing this process of reflection, I started to actually use the phone to recognize similarities in the street. I one time stopped and said, look, there is 2 dots and 2 lines of some graffiti maker that look exactly like the ones in the cave. This game became a game of references and a game of play, which actually is not literal at all. But I think my instinct as an observer wanted to connect.
To create a dialogue.
The present with the past and the past with the future. So I was looking to build a sort of triangle in my own self. And I started to collect these spots, these colors, these erased sentences, and this sort of automatic writing, as I call it, in the street. So I started to photograph, especially with my little phone, also at night, listening to music and doing long walks, which is one of my important practices of thinking. I actually need sometimes to walk 2 or 3 hours a day to reflect and think about what I'm looking at or what I'm doing. As if a sort of primitive hunter-gatherer, I'm moving across the territory of the city, and I'm thinking of a larger amount of time and space. And the encounter I make actually feed this river, which makes the primitive and the present encounter. And actually, the funny thing is that there is a lot of similarities between the 2 manifestations of the mind. What 17-year-old graffiti boys do in the street and what also primitive ancestors did in the depth of the cave. There is some stylistic and some gestural similarities. And I don't want to document this similarity. I want to feel it. So it's a game of encounters.
And it's playful too.
Exactly, because why should it not be? Things that have been separated and destroyed, why can't we try to just make them think and look one the other? Because truly looking the other is recognizing the otherness and the difference in time and space, but is also creating an invisible tunnel. Coming back to caves, a tunnel of connection between separated things. And I think that's my biggest effort, is not only to go into caves and make pictures or to be in the street and recognize fascinating graffiti of the present. I think my work as an artist, as a human being, is the one to construct this tunnel of connection.
At the beginning of the interview, we discussed how you captured urban and natural landscapes in a transitional state. And then we talk also about how you moved from these vast, precise landscapes to the mystery of the caves. Domingo, it's been a journey of zooming out and then back in again. And what I mean by that is that by zooming out and then back in, with the help of your camera lens, with your mobile, you're able to explore vast areas and the tiniest details, revealing all sorts of possibilities to the eye. And this is similar to the quantum mechanical principle of having all possibilities available and being able to navigate through them, bringing some of them into reality through observation.
The idea of the zoom I think it's actually interesting, as if the microcosm or the detail is also somehow a connection with the larger design, as if in the detail there is the collective. And this happened in the process of photographing in the caves. And this is an interesting therapy because it's the therapy of reality. Sometimes I found myself in front of a magnificent group of rectangular shapes and dots, and the spaces in the cave were so narrow that I could barely even open my tripod and my camera. But I decided to use it anyway and to try to photograph anyway with the technology I was given, which, by the way, in its origins is also called mammoth format. So the irony of things, that probably the same technology I chose to use is primitive in its own invention, and I bring it to the primitive space. But the proximity of this large camera to these incredible walls, where there is water running and ochre and ancient gestures and present geology, the proximity to these surfaces, sometimes the fact that I was obliged to photograph at 10, 15 centimeters, barely being able to focus with the large camera on the rock, that's where abstraction was born. The fact that I was obliged to keep my nose so close to something I could barely focus on. This focusing and focusing, the immense proximity of the rock, but also the enormous distance of what's behind the rock, was a relationship that made my research quite cosmic.
And in this cosmic explosion of zooming in, zooming out, I like to play an excerpt about the noetic experience, which is a sort of revelation that artists often seem to experience, and whereby something they had already intuited or felt becomes reality through this artistic expression, as you said, is born in this timeless little point where you focus, and then it breaks into a cosmic experience. Up next, we'll hear the voices of Magnum photographer Gregory Halpern, mezzo-soprano Marina Viotti, cellist Andrei Yonitsa, abstract painter Cecilia Rivera, and British orchestral conductor Karim Hassan.
When I think of making pictures, for me, it's more about really evoking feeling and creating something very open-ended that the viewer can bring themselves into, create space for them to bring themselves into. And so for me, when I think of like a literary equivalent, it's maybe closest to poetry.
Well, when I sing opera, I am a character. I'm part of a story. So I'm not Marina. Just before I enter the stage, I kind of imagine myself the whole backstory of a character, how she will walk, how she will react. Is she naive or strong or soft? When I am on stage, I forget everything about myself, about me, and I am this character in this story, and I am delivering a text and an emotion. I kind of transcend the person I am and become this ambassador or this vector of kind of a higher purpose, or at least something that will reach people's hearts.
Your deepest thoughts, even the ones of the unconscious, do come through because you're not sort of completely in control anymore. However, that's the fascinating aspect about performing. One should also be able to sort of double themselves, have this sort of overlook from above while performing, in the sense of anticipating what's coming next, always remembering yourself to breathe. to feel as grounded as possible, to find your center of gravity.
What I try is to depict the world that I imagine. What you see, what you not see, the realities we create. And I also believe that we live in different dimensions, and those vibrant colors, men dancing and interacting, going in and out, represented those dimensions, interacting continuously in our lives.
One of the greatest composers to really take you on a musical and a harmonic journey is Johannes Brahms. His symphonic writing is so extraordinary and takes you on such a complex, nuanced journey that every time you come back to these symphonies, you are discovering something new. And it's astounding because his music is so compact in a way that there is so much information. It's like taking a microscope. You can zoom in onto the individual bars, onto moments within a bar, and find some really, really interesting information about the harmony or about the way that the motifs relate to themselves. And then you can zoom out and look at the way that entire movements connect together. And so seeing that the way that this connects itself in the first place is astonishing. And because the music of Johannes Brahms is really the bread and butter of every single conductor out there, it's something that we all come back to time and time again for precisely that reason.
Domingo, after having been with your nose stuck almost onto the wall, and you could not focus anymore, having that noetic experience of breaking into abstraction. How did that experience change your perception of photography, of art in general, and self-expression?
The present. To be memory in the present. To be memory of tomorrow in the present. Somehow a form of being the river and feeling the ocean. A sort of micro and macro together. This in and out together. Also probably being opposites at one. In fact, I realize now that we talk, and with these beautiful contributions you just made me hear, make me think of this ability to unite the opposites. And this is a very ancient, also alchemic structure, the conjunctio oppositorum, the female and male, the sun and the moon, the night and the day, the red and the blue, the right and the left, the here and there, in a certain way also life and death. And this also connects to something quite incredible about the coincidences, because frankly I think after our journeys across these different questions, I think colliding coincidences seem to be the material of the discourse we have put on the table. And I have to say that there is a strange affinity between the images I was trying to photograph on the rock and the images I was trying to do with the analog film, coming back to the body and the analog element of the world. Both primitive images, as much as photographs, are created by minerals and by water. The construction of film requires water and silver minerals. The presence of the image in the cave is surrounded by humidity and water and mineral pigments. Darkness is useful to protect the image in the cave and is fundamental to shelter the image on the negative of the analog camera. And water comes again needed to develop the film, and darkness again. Darkness, water, minerals. So the camera obscura, the eye, and the cave once again seem to be in very close proximity.
And in this merging and like zooming in, zooming out, and merging, and also dismembering again in present, past, future, in whichever order you want to name them. Inside these caves, you can see the notion of a single individual's expression as well as multiple layers of expression spaced across thousands of years. And these symbols and images carry a message. Let's don't forget about this. It is the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next one. Domingo, can you imagine a cave where your father and your grandfather and the father of your grandfather and so on, would paint and carve? And could you describe what you see and what would you photograph in these drawings and carvings? And what story would you be telling?
You make me think of two beautiful and basic things. I think of fire, first of all, and I think of love. And I think the cave witnesses both of these elements. I think the cave of my ancestors and the cave of the ancestors that really painted in the caves can surely be close to each other in this common task. Without the fire, there is no light to even navigate the space of mystery. And primitive man had small torches of grease and organic material that would burn slowly and make a nice, clear light. This light, with this small lantern, is an extremely primordial gesture. And this idea of the lantern makes me think that the history of man, and if I have to imagine my grandfather or my great-grandfather, is about sharing this fire, both illuminating and both warming, a shape of love, because in reality the other thing that comes out very violently of the paintings in the depth of prehistoric caves is that if there was no love, it would have been impossible to portray that aurochs, that bison, in such a way. The deer and its horns that can be seen in different angles in a certain kind of perspective, they require a sacred love for animal, a sacred love for life, a sacred love which is also respect of the living and respect of the dead, which is something I think is essentially rare and at risk of extinction in the history of our species.
And you're mentioning fire, which was perhaps the first form of technology. But then their technology is, how can you say, not submitted, but in the periphery of something stronger and core to life and existence that you mentioned, which is love and communion. And that is perhaps what we think new technologies might endanger when love and communion are stripped away from human existence.
The problem of individuality and the problem of relationship. I think this emerges from our dialogue. The problem of seeing the individual and seeing yourself as part of something and seeing humanity as part of something instead of as an isolated, selfish phenomenon. Being the interest of few people, being the interest of a sort of culture of individualism, which is, sadly, what digitalization seems to be enhancing at incredible speed. The truth of the single voice, the truth of the single person isolated in the world with his own opinion, with his own instruments of information, and with his own self-manipulated reality. This is really what the digital has enhanced in a very, very scary way. But I think what we said about the abstraction and the primitive also leads to another concept, the connection with the nameless. Because I realized that all the work I've been doing has to do with this absence of name and surname. So the authors of the paintings in the caves, as much as the authors of the colors and the erased language I search in the street, they are both form of absence of authorship. They connect me with a larger narrative which is nameless. And this is what I would say is pure imagination.
Yes, absolutely. July 2019, after waiting for 4 years, you finally enter the Deer Cave in Puerto Badisco. You describe it as a mysterious place, a sort of capsule of ancestral sleep and celestial memory. It is a place, you write, where magical forces enable you to return to the very beginning of humanity, and therefore, inevitably, to your own childhood. Caves have always been about the past and about the future, too. In Futuro Remoto, a series of photographs that you presented at the 2024 Venice Biennale, sponsored by Giancarlo Ligabue Foundation, you recount a moment that made you feel suspended outside of linear time. As the building began to flood, the sensation of water flowing beneath your feet transported you back to Salento, the southernmost tip of Puglia, where you were born, and the time overlapped. Among the crowd was a blue-eyed child who referred to the Venus of Orocco, also known as the Mother of Life, a goddess related to the Mother of Death, found in the cave in Paravita, Salento, the place of birth of your grandfather. I saw darkness, the child said, and it is as if the goddess' eyes were closed, as if she were sleeping or dying. His blue eyes, you described, glazed over, making it feel as if time had stood still and transported you to your memories back in time. He, Giancarlo, your grandfather, also had eyes as blue as the sea, just like that child. It was at that moment, Domingo, when I was reading those lines, that I fully understood the foreword you wrote about your journey.
On those suspended days and nights, I walked back to the mouth of a river, waiting for the flow to arrive from the mountain. There, where sweet water and salt water meet, gold minerals merge with silver lights. At these gates, I would often encounter a dolphin or two, appearing and disappearing from the deep blue to a blinding sun. It is in this passage and silence that I could think to move again in time, not the present, nor the past, even less the future. I found there was a cave in me. The interior child I'd forgotten was still there, standing at the entrance of the cave. The treasure had been waiting.
And I want to ask you my last question. Now that you have reconnected to your inner child and having that clarity, when you look back on your life, you have already mentioned this memory of giving your father this clock to be sold, and that would allow you to follow your career. Can you mention maybe little stars, spots, signs in this celestial path that you have been following that you could recognize as having prepared you for this journey?
Well, everything seems to come at the mouth of the river. I was reading this beautiful passage about the fear of the river coming down to the ocean and having this big fear of becoming ocean. So the fear of the river, of the inevitable, because there is no way that the river doesn't lead to ocean. And this relationship between the small and the large, the straight passage and the force, the passage of time, I think is a very accurate image of this description of all the things you've assembled. There is not just one element or one coincidence, but I think there is something that lingers in the air, something that is there and you don't know. And it takes a lot of archaeological excavation to discover the banal, to discover the present. My search as an artist is a form of archaeology. But it's not an archaeology of proofs. It's an archaeology of emotions and connections. And after all these jumps in time and space, I think that an interesting metaphor is, for example, the place where my grandfather would bring us to swim when we were very young, which was a police station on the beach, because he was a policeman. And in this police station, you could swim right across a little cave. And that's where we learned to fish sea urchins, octopus, and we were really young kids and boys that learned this relationship with the sea. And only when I was probably 38 years old, I discovered that in that cave there was a settlement of Neolithic people in Puglia, and that there was a magnificent small head of this mother or female sacred figure. We can call her goddess. And the idea that the proximity of things or a great scheme of archaeological knowledge collide with childhood, I think that's always been something that I was trying to live, and it's also probably something that I am lived by. It's in my own genetic memory and is in my own heritage. And that cave you describe of the father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, maybe is also a reality. There is a direct link, which is in the memory of the body with these elements. Then, frankly, how to explain how I got into this project? It's absolutely pure magic, because there is coincidences that are inexplicable. One of the crucial one is the one of my wonderful friend Benjamin Weil, which was with me in New York when I was forming myself. He was the director of Artist Space, and all of a sudden I go away from New York. He moves to Spain, to an unknown location I'm not aware of. I don't even know where he exactly went. But he was the first person to have encouraged me in my process of becoming an artist, and it was also the first person that purchased a work of mine, the first I've ever sold, on a check of a bank in New York City of $1,000 when I was 23 years old. This wonderful man disappeared for a few years from my life, and when I was sort of trying to trace back where the hell did he go, I see the name of an email and I see the location of Santander. In that very same moment I'm thinking this, in the book I'm studying, the mountain of El Castillo and the main caves that I would love to even dream to visit are located a few kilometers away from Santander. So I pick up the phone, and with no previous explanation of my story, I find his office number and I call him up. Hola, Benjamin. ¿Cómo estás? And we just trace back the last few years of not having seen each other, and I suddenly just abruptly decide to ask him directly the question, do you know anything about these caves? And he stays silent on the other line of the phone. And he asks me, why? Well, I'm really interested in this. Well, Domingo, this is very strange, he tells me. I have been last week in one of these sites. There is a wonderful gentleman I've met that works across the street from my office, and is the director of the Museum of Prehistory, Roberto Antanon Peredo. Why don't you come next week that it's Eastern and we have dinner together and you tell us the story of why you're interested in caves? Not even the time to desire this, Cecilia, and in 10 days I was already visiting some of the most precious, incredible and marvelous sites you can imagine of.
Domingo, thank you so much for your thoughts, for sharing your memories, and for allowing me to use these segments of your precious, intimate, and personal writings, which have guided us listeners, myself included, into the depths of the inner cave. Your photographs are the prologue to an eternal sleepwalk where memory and cosmos meet. In a world full of war, hatred, and killing, we must find the courage to explore the cave inside us that unites us all, just like you did, to find love and communion. There we will find the treasure awaiting us, a magical place of peace and shared memories. Thank you, Domingo, for such a profound and magical interview. It was a precious gift.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's a joy to walk together in the cozy darkness of the cave.
Thank you to our listeners, wherever you are, for having allowed us to share time with you. Shall you wish to follow Domingo's steps and work, please do not forget to check this episode's description. Thank you, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.